Hey there, Cinemaster fans! Hope you're ready for some movie magic. Let's dive right in. The show opens in a dystopian world where a series of massive earthquakes has fractured the U.S., forming a vast sinkhole along the Mississippi River. The climate crisis has raised temperatures to a scorching 46 degrees Celsius, and people are impoverished, hungry, and desperate. Water is as rare and precious as oil, which now costs $2,000 per barrel. In this bleak world, the only chance at escape is by winning the blood drive, which is a deadly car race. But since the fuel prices have skyrocketed, the cars have been modified to run on human blood, which is fed into the engine's mechanisms by grinding victims. Next, we meet a beautiful woman named Grace, who is repairing her car on a desolate road. She then comes across two guys, and one of them shows interest in her and tries to flirt. She politely rejects him and drives off, but the guys start chasing her at full speed. After a while, Grace finally comes to a stop, and the troublesome guy again begins harassing her, even though his friend tells him to stop. However, just as all hope seems lost, Grace suddenly grabs her gear shift and smashes her abuser's balls before feeding him to her car engine. But since he isn't enough to fill the tank, she rips off the other guy's arms before finally driving away. The scene then cuts to Los Angeles, where a group of homeless junkies are trying to hack into one of the automated water pumps. However, it doesn't take long for the authorities to detect the breach and arrive to brutally contain them. Amid the chaos, one of the junkies tries to flee but runs into two officers, Arthur and his partner Christopher. Christopher wants to arrest him, but Arthur notices the needle marks on the junkie's arms and feels bad for him. Arthur suspects the junkie is selling blood to someone and questions him about the buyer, but the boy refuses to reveal anything. However, when Arthur hands him the confiscated water, the junkie finally provides a location of a warehouse, claiming it is where some insane people are residing. Upon returning to the station, Christopher complains to his partner for not following the guidelines of using violence. But Arthur says he was once in the same situation as the boy and tried to steal food. An officer discovered him and released him on the condition that he straighten out his life, which inspired him to become a cop. Arthur then suggests they visit the warehouse tonight, and although Christopher is reluctant at first, he eventually agrees. That night, the two officers arrive at the warehouse, where they notice a ceremony called the Mayhem Party going on, hosted by a man named Julian Slink. It turns out he's actually launching a cross-country blood drive race with a $10 million prize at stake. He reveals that all of the teams have tech chips implanted in their skulls, and they can never be too far away from their teammates, or Slink will explode their brains. Furthermore, if they finish last in any round, Slink will explode their brains. We then meet several racers, such as the Scholar, the Gentleman, Ribone, and none other than Grace. Upon seeing all this, the officers decide to call for backup to take down the illegal road race. But Arthur immediately goes to confront them alone, only to be captured by the violent crowd. Slink is intrigued by the cop and decides that he will also take part in the race. He warns Arthur that he will kill him if he doesn't put on a good show, and forces him to team up with Grace against her wishes. Slink then forcibly implants chips on both of their bodies, causing them to scream in pain. Meanwhile, Christopher tries to help his friend but is brutally beaten by Slink's men and loses consciousness. Arthur is forced into the car, and when he tries to escape, Slink uses the implant to hurt both him and Grace, forcing him back inside. As the race officially begins, Grace introduces herself, but Arthur claims he needs to go back and find his partner so they can arrest the criminals. However, she informs him that these are very powerful people and there's no way he can arrest them. The cop tries to remove his implant, but she says it's not possible to remove it, but it can be overridden if they manage to get their adrenaline high enough. This frustrates Arthur, and when he learns how the engines run on human blood, he gets even more horrified. He says, as long as he's here, no innocent people will be killed. But Grace disagrees and reveals that she desperately needs to win this race to pay for treatment for her sister Karma and bring her home. She also claims that a camera has been installed in the car and that the organizers can see and hear everything they do. Not long after, the duo passes by a roadside where Ribone has amputated some cheerleaders and is using their limbs to fuel his car. This infuriates Arthur, who forces Grace to stop the car and immediately goes to confront Ribone. The two men get into a brutal fight until Ribone eventually leaves the girls alone and drives off. Meanwhile, Grace realizes that her car has broken down because of Arthur's actions and gets frustrated. She uses binoculars and spots another team driving by, then sets a trap for them. Soon, the Gentleman and the Scholar, who are a couple, come across the trap, prompting them to halt their car. Grace then threatens to chop off their hands and orders them to fix her vehicle. The Gentleman agrees and asks the Scholar to do the job since he is an excellent mechanic. After the car is fixed up, Arthur and Grace move on. But they soon get into trouble when they realize their car has ended up in last place. which means Slick will use the implant to kill them. Just when all hope seems lost, Grace comes up with the idea of getting intimate to spike their adrenaline and override the implant. Arthur has no choice but to agree, and the two end up making love in the car as they race toward the finish line. The plan ends up working, and the pair live to fight another day. That evening, during another mayhem party, Slink informs Arthur that he has recalibrated the pulse charges, meaning they can't use the same trick in the next race. He also gives Arthur a business card, which reveals that Slink is a member of an organization called Heart Enterprise. Arthur is shocked to learn this, as Heart Enterprise is the most powerful organization in the country, controlling everything from housing to food, hospitals, and even the police. Next, Arthur approaches Grace and assures her that they will win the race, and she can keep the money. In exchange, she must help him in his plans to bring down the entire operation and expose these psychos, which Grace agrees to. The scene then cuts to a place called Pixie Swallow Diner, where a cheerful waitress is seen taking orders and serving food. But in the back room, we see a chef named Carl, who is brutally cutting up human bodies to prepare the meals. Elsewhere, it's the second day of the race, and we notice that Arthur is studying some old newspapers to investigate the origins of Heart Enterprise. He discovers that Heart Enterprise caused the water shortages, earthquakes, and heat waves by using harmful resource extraction and polluting the air through heavy industry. Grace then reminds him that their car is running out of fuel, but Arthur makes it clear that he can't hurt an innocent person. The duo then gets information that their destination for today is Pixie Swallow. They soon arrive at the same diner we saw earlier, but something feels off, as there's no one around to give them further instructions. Elsewhere, Slink arrives at Heart Enterprise on his superior's orders, but the receptionist tells him to wait in the lobby, which clearly annoys him. While waiting, Slink meets a cheerful man who nervously explains that he's here for a job interview. He reveals that the company has decided to fire someone and called him in to replace them, which makes Slink worried. Meanwhile, we see Arthur and Grace at the Pixie Swallow Diner, eating burgers without realizing they're made of human meat. That evening, all the racers end up staying at the motel next door, which is also owned by Carl. Arthur is then seen eating dinner when he finds a human nail in his food, which horrifies him. He goes to the back room, where he overhears Carl and his daughter discussing that they don't have any more meat to make food. But the creepy chef assures her that he will call some of his boys, who will arrive and butcher the racers. Upon hearing this, Arthur is horrified and immediately goes to inform Grace, who ends up vomiting in disgust. The two then decide to leave the place immediately, but the problem is their car isn't running. Furthermore, things get worse when a group of cannibals arrives and begins slashing people, violently creating chaos and panic. Arthur and Grace then head inside the motel and go to find the scholar who can fix their car, but it turns out he isn't in the room, so they assume the chef must have kidnapped him and taken him to the kitchen. In another scene, Slink is approached again by the cheerful man who has just come back from his interview. The guy reveals that they decided to hire him on the spot and that his mom is going to be so happy, but Slink thinks he's stealing his job and gets very angry. He uses his briefcase to attack the man and mercilessly slaughters him until he's crushed to death. At this moment, an employee arrives and informs Slink they're ready for the meeting. She further reveals that the man who just died was hired for maintenance, which means Slink killed him for nothing. Back at the diner, Arthur uses the phone to reach Christopher and explains everything about how he's being forced to drive in this deadly race. He also tells him about Karma, who's in an asylum, and asks Christopher to investigate her situation. After checking some files, Christopher shocks Arthur by revealing that Karma is in a hospital owned by none other than Heart Enterprise. Returning to Slink, he attends a meeting with the employee, which annoys him since he wanted to meet the chairperson, but she rudely tells him that he's not worthy of the chairman's attention. She then warns him that he's treading on dangerous ground by entering Arthur into the race since he's a cop. She further reveals that the seniors were planning to kill him today, but after seeing how he killed that man, they change their minds since blood and gore are exactly what they want. The woman also reveals that the company wants to broadcast the race for the public, so he must improve the show, or else he will get fired. Meanwhile, at the diner, Arthur, Grace, and the gentleman head to the kitchen, where they fight off Carl and his staff. They find the scholar wrapped in plastic, ready to be chopped, and manage to free him. However, in the midst of the chaos, Carl grabs Grace and puts her in the back of his truck before driving away. This causes immense pain for both Arthur and Grace, as their implants don't allow teammates to be too far from each other. After the scholar fixes his car, Arthur goes after the chef's truck to get Grace back. An epic chase ensues between them until Arthur manages to block the road and starts beating up Carl. The chef begs for mercy, saying there was no money to buy beef, and chicken is also extinct, so he had no choice but to use human meat to survive. But Arthur refuses to believe him and arrests the cannibal chef for his crimes. However, Grace goes one step further and kills Carl with a sharp object before feeding him to her car to use as fuel. Arthur doesn't intervene this time, knowing Carl was a bad man who had done horrible things. Afterwards, Arthur informs Grace about his conversation with his colleague and reveals that Karma is in a hospital owned by Hart Enterprises. He believes this isn't a random connection and that she's being deliberately played by the organizers. This worries Grace, so they decide to make a detour the day after tomorrow and visit the hospital where Karma is supposed to be staying. The following day, another race begins, this time with Utah as the destination. However, Grace and Arthur get into trouble when they experience a sudden tire blowout. Grace manages to temporarily fix it, but they soon realize they need to take a shortcut through a place called Steel City to get car parts. It turns out Steel City was once a car manufacturing town, but after the massive fracking earthquake, it was declared abandoned and nobody knew why. Troops were sent in to rescue any survivors, but were never heard from again. Sometime later, the duo finally arrives at Steel City and the place looks completely deserted. They then hear some kind of creature crawling in the distance, which scares them. The duo decides to leave the place immediately, but just then, a group of creepy people shows up, prompting them to hide. The group's team leader is amazed to see a new car arrive out of nowhere, and they decide to present it to their supervisor. They then steal the car and enter a bunker-like place that requires a password, which Arthur manages to memorize. Afterwards, Arthur and Grace also use the password and head inside to retrieve their car. They quietly hide and observe as the team leader presents the vehicle to their supervisor named Mercedes. The group seems to be some kind of cult that worships something called synergy and worships chassis and bobbleheads. Mercedes turns out to be their cult leader, who sits atop a mountain of broken electronic devices like a throne and makes them worship synergy with bizarre movements. Upon seeing this, Arthur and Grace are shocked and realize that these people are completely crazy. Arthur then decides to reveal himself as a distraction, while Grace proceeds to get back the car. The group immediately tries to attack Arthur, but Mercedes orders them to split up and make sure no one else is around. After they leave, Mercedes begins interrogating Arthur, demanding to know what he's doing there. He explains that he's a racer and just needs his car to leave without any trouble, but Mercedes reveals they can't leave the place at night for some reason. She then tries to attack him, but Grace appears with a weapon and threatens her to back off. Just then, they hear growling and snarling in the distance, which worries Mercedes. It turns out that while Arthur and Grace were sneaking inside, they left the door open, letting the creatures in. Mercedes then reveals that these creatures are called Glemmers, and they used to be humans, but something poisoned their water, turning them into monstrous creatures. These creatures then became addicted to gasoline and are so sensitive to light that they explode whenever it shines on them. Mercedes adds that her group scavenges during the day, but never leaves at night. They can't leave Steel City either because they don't have enough gas. In the meantime, the Glemmers begin appearing and killing the cult members one by one in the dark. Mercedes and Arthur then decide to grab the little gasoline left in the storage room so they can turn on the generator. On the way, she asks how they managed to get all the way here, and Arthur accidentally reveals that their car runs on human blood. Upon hearing this, Mercedes suddenly comes up with an idea to finally escape this place. She locks Arthur inside the storage room before running off to find the car. Elsewhere, Grace is waiting for them when she tries feeding the Glemmer blood to her car. The blood shockingly turns out to be some kind of superpowered fuel, making the car go insanely fast. She rushes to find Arthur and frees him after discovering him trapped in the storage room. Meanwhile, Mercedes manages to find their car and attempts to leave the place on her own, but the team leader spots her and accuses her of betraying their trust and abandoning them. In a final act of revenge, he shuts off the lights, causing the Glemmers to swarm in and finish them off. Next, Arthur and Grace light some fireworks to keep the mutants away as they rush toward their car. On the way, Arthur is shocked when he notices that the factory belongs to Hart Enterprises, meaning the corporation was behind the town's downfall. They manage to get into their car, but hungry and violent Glemmers still surround them. Grace then destroys them with the car's headlights and collects their blood for later use as fuel. With this, the duo finally escapes the cursed city and reaches the finish line just in time before the last racer. That evening, during another mayhem party, the duo plans to visit Karma's hospital, which is not far away. But this means Slink will blow their heads off, so Grace comes up with an idea. She approaches the scholar and shows him the power of Glimmerblood, which can turn their vehicle into a supercar. This impresses the scholar, so Grace offers to share it with him if he tampers with the remote control Slink uses to blow their heads off. The scholar agrees to help her, although he reminds her that if the organizers find out, she will be in great trouble. In the next scene, the duo are on their way to visit the asylum so they can meet Karma. Slink immediately finds out about this and tries to torture them with the implant, but realizes that it's not working anymore. On the other hand, we see Arthur and Grace arriving at the asylum, where the receptionist is ravenously eating a candy bar. Grace asks about Karma and her doctor, Kleinfeld, but the receptionist doesn't show any concern. He seems weird and doesn't reveal anything other than that Carmel was transferred. Returning to Slink, he summons Ribbon and orders him to go after Arthur and finish the man. He gives him the location as well, but urges him not to hurt Grace as he needs her alive. Meanwhile, in the asylum, Grace is walking through the halls and finds that the place is in turmoil as the deranged patients have broken free. This reminds Grace of the time when she went clubbing with her sister before she became sick. It turns out that Grace wanted to find a guy named Primo and seduce him as he would help her get in the cross race. Karma wasn't comfortable with the situation but reluctantly supported her sister as they were dirt broke. In the present, Ribbon also arrives at the asylum and asks the receptionist for information about Arthur, but the latter is messily eating candy half-naked. So Ribbon offers him more candies in exchange for information. At the same time, Arthur is wandering through the asylum when he comes across a nurse who is trapped in a room. He frees her, and she reveals how the patients rioted and murdered most of the doctors and nurses. Just then, Ribbon activates the red alert in the hospital, which makes the patients even more violent. Arthur then urges the nurse to help him find Dr. Kleinfeld, so she reveals that if they want to survive, they'll have to pretend to be crazy too. Next, we see another flashback of how Karma was approached and harassed by a guy in the club. But fortunately, Grace intervened and got rid of the guy before anything could happen. Karma then urged her sister to leave, saying she didn't feel comfortable, but Grace wasn't willing to give up without meeting Primo. Soon enough, Primo showed up, and instead of taking care of her sister, Grace went to seduce him. All this while, we see Slink, who was a DJ at the club, observing everything with interest. In the present, the nurse and Arthur make their way through a bloodied hallway while pretending to be crazy. The nurse then reveals that this place hasn't been an asylum in years, as the patients have actually been used as test subjects. It turns out Hard Enterprise made a new candy named Smacks, which included very powerful chemicals. It was promoted as something that wouldn't make people fat like regular sugar, but it actually makes people insane. As a result, all these patients got addicted to sugar, along with an intense desire to eat and kill. In another scene, Grace finally manages to find Dr. Kleinfeld, but he is badly injured. She desperately asks him about her sister, but the doctor doesn't say anything beyond, "You have to save them." Before he can say more, a deranged patient shows up and ends up killing him, leaving Grace frustrated. She then gets into a fight with the patient, and after a long and brutal struggle, she manages to kill him but accidentally causes a short circuit that starts a fire. Afterward, Grace finally reunites with Arthur, who is with the nurse. Grace desperately asks the nurse about her sister, but the latter has no information. Just then, they hear Ribbon's voice over the intercom, revealing he has a box of candy and will give it to the one who will hand him the cop. Upon hearing this, the crazed patients start searching for Arthur and attack him, though he manages to fight them off with Grace's help. In another flashback, we see Karma indulging in drugs after her sister went off to dance with Primo. She was clearly struggling, and although Grace noticed this, she was too busy seducing Primo. In the present, Grace notices the nurse wearing Karma's necklace and starts to choke her, asking how she found it. The nurse frantically reveals that Karma left it behind when she was transferred. However, she doesn't know who checked her out, so she offers to take them to the storage closet by reception to get the file. The problem is, Ribbon is also at the reception, so they must find a way around him. Soon, they arrive at the reception area, but to their shock, the nurse ends up betraying them. It's revealed that she's also addicted to sugar and demands candy from Ribbon in exchange for bringing them here. Arthur is then attacked by the crazed receptionist, while Grace is drugged by Ribbon. While Grace slowly loses consciousness, she recalls the day Karma was admitted to the hospital. The girl became so addicted to the drugs that she was unable to function normally. After tearfully leaving her in the hospital, Grace exited the building and found Slink waiting for her. He had modified her car to run on blood as fuel and offered her a spot in the blood drive. The desperate Grace also couldn't refuse, as it promised enough money to set up a future for both her and Karma. In the present, Arthur and Ribbon get into a brutal fight, leaving both of them badly injured. Arthur fights the best he can and even hits Ribbon with a fire extinguisher, but the strong guy still overpowers him. At one point, Arthur comes across a bucket full of sugar and comes up with an idea. He douses Ribbon with all the sugar, which immediately attracts the attention of the deranged patients. They all rush toward the big guy and begin brutally devouring him, finally ending his life. Moments later, Grace regains consciousness and spots a picture on the wall that shocks her. The building is about to burn, so Arthur rushes her to leave and she takes the picture with her. The duo then manages to escape safely just as the building explodes in flames. Sometime later, the duo returns to the MAM party right when Slink reactivates the device and begins torturing them. However, he just leaves them with a warning and urges them to join the party with the rest of the racers. Arthur then apologizes to Grace that they couldn't find her sister, but she shows him a picture she found in the hospital, shockingly revealing that Slink was one of the doctors there. This revelation shocks Arthur, so they decide to confront the man and torture the information out of him. Not wasting any time, the duo immediately approach Slink and forcibly handcuff him to a chair. They try various methods to torture him, but the psychopath feels no pain and instead laughs maniacally. Grace repeatedly demands information about Karma, but Slink refuses to reveal anything. Outside, a huge party is going on where we meet twin siblings Jack and Diane, who scan the crowd. It turns out that they're here to find Julian Slink and exact revenge. Slink was involved in the destruction of their town and the death of their parents, and now they have only each other. The problem is, they've never met Slink in person and don't know what he looks like. In the meantime, Grace and Arthur are still interrogating Slink. While outside, the crowd chants his name. The duo realize that if Slink won't come out, the crowd will soon burst in. So Arthur dresses up as Slink, wearing a hat and feathered jacket, and goes on stage to greet the crowd. He cracks some lame jokes, but the crowd finds him too boring compared to Slink and begins throwing stuff at him. Elsewhere, Jack and Diane also notice him and assume he must be Slink. They then set their plan in motion by going around and kissing everyone. Apparently, they are carriers of the Dionysus strain, a deadly virus that turns the afflicted into violent creatures desperate for lust. The twins spread the virus to everyone through their kisses, making them extremely horny so they won't interfere in their plan to kill Slink. Soon, Arthur is attacked by a man on stage, but he swiftly overpowers and defeats him. The crowd erupts with excitement, and Arthur realizes they crave violence and gore. He thus storms off the stage and unleashes a fierce assault on the crowd and beats people aggressively, which finally entertains the crowd. At the same time, the twins have spread their virus to almost the entire crowd, who are wildly copulating with whoever they come across and producing a strange blue fluid. We also notice that Jack and Diane have feelings for each other but are too hesitant to act on their desires. As they watch the lustful crowd, they recall their parents who used to aggressively make love until they eventually killed each other. Just then, Arthur is approached by a group of girls who kiss him, passing the virus to him as well. Meanwhile, inside, Slink manages to sneakily uncuff himself without Grace noticing. He then tells Grace that someone at Hart Enterprise is very interested in her, and that he's the one pulling all the strings. Slink readies his knife to attack, but suddenly smells something and asks Grace to look outside. She informs him how everyone out there is lost in a wild frenzy and looks blue, except for the two people, who seem harmless. However, Slink frantically tells her that those twins are very dangerous and asks for her help in defeating them. He further reveals how Hart Enterprise experimented on this town many years ago, involving a virus called the Dionysus strain. The virus has 3 stages. The first is a euphoric attack that causes all repression to be released. The second is when the body's fluids turn blue. And the third is when they become zombies and start killing each other. In this way, the whole town was destroyed by the experiment, and only the twins survived. Slink then asks Grace for her help by going to the nearby lab to find the antidote for the virus. Grace refuses, but he manages to convince her by saying that if he dies, she will never find out Karma's location. Outside, the twins approach Arthur and try to attack him, thinking he is Slink. But fortunately, Grace intervenes just in time and reveals that he isn't Slink, but a cop named Arthur. The twins also believe her and leave to find the real culprit. Afterwards, Arthur feels horny due to the virus and tries to make a move on Grace, but she refuses his advances. She then tells him about their dire situation and orders him to urgently head to the lab to find the antidote for the virus. Upon hearing this, Arthur heads to the lab while the twins approach Slink inside his cabin. Diane doesn't waste any time kissing him, but it turns out he is immune to the virus just like the twins. They begin accusing him of the death of their parents, but Slink doesn't seem apologetic and says the town was too repressed and he did them a favor. Upon hearing this, the enraged twins begin torturing him and show him a big crushing machine they have brought to end his life. Outside, the crowd has gotten out of control as they have reached the final stage of the virus and have started killing each other. Elsewhere, Arthur, who is in the lab, watches several videos of the experiment and finds out that when 2 siblings get intimate, they produce an orange fluid, which is the antidote for their virus. He immediately goes to find Grace and gives her this information. This shocks Grace, and she realizes that the only way out of this situation is if Jack and Diane get intimate. Grace soon arrives at Slink's cabin where the twins are trying to crush him in the machine. Outside, a violent crowd is trying to break in and Arthur does everything he can to hold them back. Grace then starts to manipulate the twins, telling them she understands the pain of suppressed urges and that instead of fighting them, they should embrace those feelings. She claims she has seen the look Jack and Diane give each other and urges them to express their emotions instead of holding them inside. Upon hearing this, the twins finally succumb to their desire and begin getting passionately intimate. Slink then seizes the moment to collect the orange fluid, after which he crushes them in the machine. Just then, the violent crowd bursts inside, but before they can do any damage, Grace sprays them with the orange fluid. This finally calms them down, and the situation is brought back under control. The next morning, Grace approaches Slink and asks him to fulfill the promise he made. The guy agrees and reveals that Karma was transferred from the asylum to a place called Clareville Rehabilitation Center. He claims that he has rerouted the race today to pass through that place, and if she wants to go there, he won't stop her. But if she is the last one to come to the finish line, the rules still apply, meaning her head will be exploded. Afterward, Grace approaches Arthur to tell him all this, and they plan to get ahead of the pack so they can rescue Karma and still make it back in time to finish the race. Arthur then apologizes for trying to make a move on her last night, but she doesn't mind, as he was under the influence of the virus. Soon enough, the race begins, and Slink gives a daunting new challenge. They must ride through a dangerous place called Savage Lands, where every time the brakes are applied, the engine shuts down for 10 minutes. This worries our protagonists, but Grace remains fiercely determined to find her sister no matter what. Sometime later, they enter the Savage Lands when a group of barbarians suddenly arrives on motorcycles. They begin attacking the racers and even manage to kill a few of them. They cause many crashes and explosions in the area, but our protagonists keep driving. At one point, the duo notices a vehicle in the middle of the road, and Arthur urges Grace to hit the brakes. She then reluctantly stops the car, activating the 10-minute penalty. Grace soon pushes the vehicle, and it turns out to be just a facade of painted wood made to look like a wrecked truck. Since they can't drive away, the barbarians soon manage to catch up to them. They step off their motorcycles and remove their masks, revealing that they are all women. Arthur tries to reason with them, but a woman named Carolina immediately hits him and knocks him out. Afterward, the barbarian group captures and takes the duo to a place called Majora. It turns out these people run a retreat for women in the middle of the desert. Men are treated like animals here, while women are treated like queens. After brutally torturing and beating Arthur, they toss him in a cage, while Grace is taken for a spa treatment. Carolina claims that the place is paradise for women and urges her to stay, but Grace bluntly tells her she can't stay because she needs to find her sister. Elsewhere, Arthur meets another prisoner who seems to be in a very bad condition. Arthur asks what these women want from them, and the man reveals the one thing they can't get on their own. It turns out they use a milking machine to extract sperm to artificially inseminate themselves. Arthur looks through the bars and sees a makeshift lab where a woman is attaching a hose to a man's groin. Above them, a large jar is slowly filling with semen via a tube connected to the man, which horrifies Arthur. In another scene, Grace decides she can't stay any longer and tries to leave, but the women try to stop her. Grace states that she needs to go to Clareville Rehabilitation Center, and Caroline shockingly reveals that all these women used to be inmates there. They were tortured and assaulted there, so they rebelled and burned the hospital down. This horrifies Grace, and she asks Caroline if they know her sister Karma, who was also an inmate. Caroline is surprised to hear the name and reveals that Karma has been with them since the beginning. Meanwhile, Arthur is summoned for the milking of his semen, but he seizes the moment to fight back and attempts to escape. Unfortunately, the women quickly overpower him and begin brutally beating him. Elsewhere, Slink is in Hart Enterprises' office where he meets two executives who criticize Blood Drive's weak, uncool characters. They want more racers to wear sunglasses, smoke cigarettes, and demand higher death counts per episode. They also insist that Slink use proper grammar in his reports, which irritates him so much that he stabs one of them with a throwing knife. At this point, we finally meet the big boss, who is the chairman of Hart Enterprises. He also agrees that the show's quality is declining and reveals that next week they will finally broadcast publicly, but without Slink. Hearing this, Slink is enraged and begins to protest, so the big boss reveals that they actually want him dead. At this moment, the injured executive on the floor suddenly rises and mutters that Slink can't be killed before collapsing dead. Elsewhere, Caroline reveals to Grace how Karma was the one who led the rebellion, and she was the bravest among them. She then takes her to a room filled with a shrine dedicated to Karma. Caroline shockingly hands Grace her sister's hospital band and reveals that Karma passed away during the rebellion. Upon hearing this, a shocked Grace feels overwhelmed with guilt for leaving her sister and breaks down in tears. Afterward, Caroline asks Grace why the two parted ways when they were so close. Grace reveals there was a guy involved, and Caroline comments that men are the problem behind everything in the world. This only irritates Grace, who asks her to leave, prompting Caroline to walk out. After crying and mourning for her sister, Grace decides to leave the place and heads out. Outside, we notice Caroline accusing Arthur of ruining Grace's life and torturing him. She's about to kill him when suddenly Grace grabs one of the girls as a hostage and urges Caroline to leave him alone. Caroline then accuses Grace of being brainwashed by the Seedmakers and begins beating her up. The two get into a brutal fight and Caroline nearly manages to kill Grace. But at the last moment, she notices Grace's necklace with Karma's picture and is struck with guilt. She decides she doesn't want to hurt another woman and eventually walks away. Sometime later, our protagonists are back on the road when Arthur expresses his sorrow over what happened to Grace's sister. He claims that Hart Enterprises is responsible for what happened and that they should take down their entire operation to bring justice to Karma and other victims. However, Grace appears to have lost all motivation to carry on and remains silent as the episode comes to an end. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a